Hi, my name is Shawn Williams, and I'll be talking about theorist John B. Watson. John Watson is widely regarded as the founder of the behaviorist school of psychology. He advocated the elimination of all introspection from psychology and urged that the science's goals be prediction and behavioral control. Watson was born on January 9, 1878, in Greensville, South Carolina. As a student, he was lazy, argumentative, impatient, and during his youth was arrested twice. While he was 6'10", he began attending Greensville Furman College in a special program for younger students, but after a year, he became a freshman. He graduated from school in 1899, and after 5 years there had only one thing to say about his experience. Until college becomes a place where daily living can be taught, we must look tolerantly upon it as a place for boys and girls to be penned up until they reach their majority. Once Watson finished his doctorate, he worked as an assistant in experimental psychology from 1903 to 1904. In the summer of 1904, he assisted and observed surgical techniques on animals at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. It was there that Watson became convinced that both lower and higher animals learn only through trial and error, not by logical reasoning. Over the next several years, Watson continued to develop his theory about what he came to call behaviorism. By 1908, many people in the psychological community knew about him, whether they agreed with him or not. Soon after, Johns Hopkins University offered him a full professorship in experimental and comparative psychology. Also in 1908, he became the editor of the Psychological Review. Once he was settled in at Johns Hopkins, Watson started a series of experiments whose goals were to determine if instincts exist and if there are basic unlearned reactions. He started publishing his findings in 1912, and by 1913 released his famous paper on behaviorism, which is cited as the advent of the school of thought. In it, Watson stated his belief that psychologically speaking, people should be treated just like an animal, to the extent of considering only what the person does in controlled situations and making no note of what he or she observes or thinks during the experiment. Watson added later that the person would make more progress psychologically if the therapist ignored the subject's confusion and consciousness. Overcoming a huge amount of aversion toward his request to experiment on babies, Watson finally received permission to examine all the newborns at Johns Hopkins Hospital. In his 1919 book, Psychology from the Standpoint of a Behaviorist, he used his experiment with them to propose that heredity is almost unimportant in a human's actions and that the only unlearned reactions are love, fear, and anger. He argued that psychology should be strictly limited to the study of objectively observable behavior, and that behavior should be discussed only in terms of stimulus and response. While working with an 11-year-old named Albert, Watson and Rosa Lee Rayner showed how specific fears might be conditioned. Like most infants, little Albert feared loud noises but not white rats. Watson and Rayner presented a white rat, and as little Albert reached to touch it, struck a hammer against a steel bar just behind his head. After seven repeats of seeing the rat and hearing the noise, Albert burst into tears at the mere sight of the rat. What's more important is 5 days later, Albert showed the same conditioned response by reacting with fear to a rabbit, a dog, and a sealskin coat, but not to dissimilar objects such as toys. After his dismissal from Johns Hopkins, because of an affair with his assistant, Watson became the J. Walter Thompson's advertising agency's resident psychologist. There he used his knowledge of associative learning to conceive many successful campaigns, including one for Maxwell House that helped make the coffee break an American custom. In 1924, Watson was appointed vice president of the J. Walter Thompson's company. He also began writing articles again for many popular books and magazines, and in the 1920s wrote 3 books, Behaviorism, Ways of Behaviorism, and Psychological Care of the Infant and Child. Meanwhile, he had left. By the 1920s, Watson's reputation among his scientific peers had waned because he was perceived as having sold out to industry, yet behaviorism had become a dominant psychological technique. Nevertheless, Watson's technique technical contributions to his field had ended when he left Johns Hopkins. Watson spent the last 2 decades of his life in advertising, where he achieved a large measure of success. He died in New York City on September 25, 1958.